There is a flight school in the American Midwest that just took delivery of two brand new trainer aircraft. Not Cessnas, not Pipers, not anything built in Wichita or Vero Beach or anywhere else in the continental United States. They are Indian-built light sport aircraft, manufactured by a company most American pilots have never heard of, certified under FAA standards, and priced at roughly 40% of what the domestic competition is asking for a comparable airframe. And they are not alone. Two other American flight schools have already done the same thing, quietly, without press releases, without air show debuts in front of 20,000 people, without the kind of industry fanfare that usually follows a story this significant. Three schools, real airplanes, real students flying them right now. That is not a footnote. That is not an interesting curiosity to file away and forget about. That is a signal flare going up over an industry that has been telling itself a particular story about where competition comes from and where it doesn't, and that story is starting to look a lot less airtight than it did even 5 years ago. Before we get into exactly who this manufacturer is, how they got here, what the airplanes actually are, what the American schools buying them are paying versus what they were paying before, and what every single person in this industry, whether you're a flight school owner, a CFI, a student, a manufacturer, a dealer, or just someone who cares about where general aviation is going, needs to understand about what this means for the next decade of pilot training in this country. Hit subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of story that the established players in this industry would prefer stayed quiet, and it's exactly the kind of breakdown you need to hear if you want to understand where the real pressure on new aircraft pricing and flight training economics is actually coming from right now, not the version the marketing departments want you to believe. Let's set the stage properly, because if you walk into the specific details without understanding the context, the numbers sound surprising, but the significance doesn't land the way it should. American flight training is in a genuinely strange place right now. On one hand, demand for pilots has never looked stronger on paper. The airline hiring wave, the regional carrier expansion, the post-pandemic travel surge that showed no signs of returning to pre-2020 norms, all of it created a cultural moment where learning to fly got rebranded as a career pathway with serious economic upside rather than just an expensive hobby with a license at the end. Flight schools around the country saw enrollment inquiries spike. Discovery flight bookings went through the roof. The pipeline looked, from a headline perspective, healthier than it had in a generation. On the other hand, the economics of actually running a flight school got measurably worse during the exact same period. Fuel costs jumped, then partially retreated, then jumped again. Insurance premiums across the training fleet climbed in ways that genuinely shocked operators who'd been budgeting based on prior year rates. Instructor retention became a crisis in its own right, with CFIs departing for regional airlines faster than schools could replace them, and sitting underneath all of that, the single largest line item in any flight school's capital expense budget, the cost of acquiring and maintaining trainer aircraft, kept moving in one direction. A new Cessna 172 Skyhawk, the airplane that has been the backbone of American primary flight training for decades, the airplane that generations of pilots have learned on, the airplane that occupies such a dominant position in the trainer market that its name has essentially become a generic term for flight training, the same way Kleenex became a generic term for tissue. That airplane now costs somewhere around $450,000 when you spec it the way a modern flight school actually needs to spec it, with a glass panel, with the avionics suite that meets what CFIs and students expect to see, with the options and configurations that make an airplane suitable for a serious training environment, rather than a bare-bones weekend flyer. $450,000. For a single-engine, fixed-gear, normally aspirated trainer that is, in its fundamental engineering bones, a direct descendant of an airplane designed in the 1950s. The airframe evolution is real, the safety improvements are real, the avionics are genuinely transformative compared to what that airplane wore 40 years ago. But the core mission, teaching someone to fly an airplane with a prop on the nose and 4 seats and fixed landing gear, has not changed, and the price has climbed to a level that is genuinely straining the financial model of flight schools that need to put multiple airplanes on the line. Do the math from a flight school operator's perspective. If you want a fleet of 6 trainers, which is not a large fleet by any measure, 6 airplanes is a small to mid-size operation. You're looking at roughly $2.7 million in capital expenditure before you've hired a single instructor, signed a single lease, or posted a single social media advertisement. And that's before financing, before insurance on the fleet, before maintenance reserves, before the cost of the parts stockpile you'd better have ready, because supply chain delays on certified aircraft parts have become a real operational headache for a lot of schools in the last several years. A lot of flight schools aren't buying 6 airplanes. They're buying 1 or 2, because that's all they can afford, flying them until the tack time is completely exhausted, and managing perpetual capacity constraints that limit how many students they can train simultaneously. The economics don't allow for anything different. The price point has essentially rationed access to new equipment in a way that hurts the schools, hurts the students who wait longer for slots, and ultimately hurts the pipeline that the airlines and everyone else in aviation is counting on. That is the environment into which this Indian manufacturer has just walked, carefully, methodically, with certifications in hand and airplanes already delivering to American customers, at a price that is 60% lower than what the domestic incumbent is asking. The company is called DigiFly Aviation, and if that name doesn't ring a bell for you, that's completely understandable, because they haven't exactly been running Super Bowl advertisements. They are based in India, where they have been building and operating light sport class aircraft for several years. They entered the Indian aviation training market during a period when India's civil aviation sector was going through one of its most significant expansion phases in history, when the Indian government was aggressively pushing to increase the number of licensed pilots to support a domestic airline industry that was adding routes and aircraft faster than it could staff them. Building affordable, certified training aircraft for that environment was not a hobby project. It was a serious commercial undertaking in response to serious commercial demand. The airplane they're bringing to American flight schools is called the DigiFly Spark. It is a 2-seat, side-by-side light sport aircraft powered by a Rotax 912 series engine, which is important to note because the Rotax 912 is not some unknown or unproven power plant in the American market. Rotax engines power a substantial portion of the light sport and experimental fleet in the United States. There are shops that know these engines intimately in virtually every major metro area. There is a supply chain for parts that is robust by light sport standards. When a school considering the Spark asks about engine maintenance and overhaul, they're not being asked to bet on an unfamiliar power plant. They're being asked to bet on an airframe wrapped around an engine they can already get serviced. The airframe itself is constructed primarily from composite materials, which is, again, not unusual in the light sport segment. This is the standard architecture for most purpose-built modern light sport aircraft. The panel is Garmin-based, which matters enormously for a training environment, because Garmin avionics have become essentially the universal standard in professional flight training across the United States, and students who learn on Garmin Glass translate their skills directly to the airline cockpits they're eventually going to occupy. Stall characteristics are benign enough to be appropriate for primary training. Cruise speed sits comfortably within the light sport envelope. The visibility from the cockpit is excellent for the kind of scanning and situational awareness training that forms the foundation of good airmanship. None of that is revolutionary. None of it is dramatically different from what you'd find in comparable domestic light sport trainers. The airplane does what a training airplane needs to do. It does it safely, it does it with certified systems, and it does it at a price that lands around $170,000 to $190,000 depending on configuration and options. Let that number sit for a moment, next to the $450,000 Cessna. If you are a flight school operator and you are evaluating your next trainer acquisition and someone puts those two numbers side by side on a spreadsheet, the conversation that follows is not a brief one, because you are not just looking at a difference in price, you are looking at a difference in how many airplanes you can put on the line for the same capital investment. At those numbers, the capital you'd spend on 3 Cessnas buys you roughly 7 or 8 Sparks. 7 or 8 airframes means 7 or 8 simultaneous training slots instead of 3. For a school managing wait lists and slot scarcity, that difference in fleet size is not a rounding error. It is the difference between being a business that is perpetually turning students away and being a business that can actually grow to meet demand. The 3 American schools that have already made this move are not making a statement about flag waving or supply chain politics or anything ideological. They are running the math, looking at what they need to accomplish operationally, and concluding that the economics of this decision are too compelling to ignore based on country of origin alone. That is a completely rational response to a completely real problem, and it's going to keep producing the same conclusion for other operators as long as the price gap stays this wide. Now let's talk about the certification picture in detail, because this is the first question a serious buyer asks, and it's the right question. In aviation, it looks good and it seems to fly well. is not sufficient to put students in it. The certification pathway matters enormously. The Spark has been manufactured under processes consistent with ASTM standards, which are the consensus-based technical standards that govern the light sport aircraft category in the United States. This is not the same as traditional FAA-type certification under FAR Part 23, and that distinction matters, so let's be honest about it rather than glossing over it. Light sport aircraft in the United States operate under a different certification framework, the Special Light Sport Aircraft category, which relies on manufacturer declaration of compliance with ASTM standards rather than an individualized FAA-type certificate for each design. That framework was specifically created to allow more flexible, lower-cost pathways for aircraft in this category, and it has enabled an enormous variety of light sport aircraft from manufacturers around the world to operate legally in American airspace. The practical implication for a flight school is that the Spark can be operated for sport pilot training, can be used for instruction toward a sport pilot certificate, and can legally be flown by sport pilots. What it cannot currently do, and this is a meaningful limitation worth being completely clear about, is serve as the primary trainer for private pilot candidates who need to complete their training in aircraft with specific certification requirements, or for instrument training, or for the full pathway toward a commercial certificate in the traditional sense. If a school's primary business is taking students from zero to private pilot in a Cessna 172 on a Part 141 curriculum, the Spark, in its current configuration, does not fully replace that airplane. But that limitation is only disqualifying if you think about this airplane as a direct one-for-one Cessna replacement. The schools that have already bought it are not thinking about it that way, and understanding how they are thinking about it is really the key to understanding why this matters. Primary flight training has a structure that most people outside the industry don't think about carefully. Before a student ever gets near instrument approaches or cross-country planning, or any of the more advanced skills that private pilot training encompasses, they spend a substantial number of hours on fundamentals: straight and level flight, turns, climbs and descents, slow flight, stall recognition and recovery, basic traffic pattern operations, takeoffs and landings repeated until they become automatic, emergency procedure flows, the basic physical and mental grammar of controlling an airplane in space. All of that, a meaningful portion of the early hours of primary flight training, happens in a relatively simple airplane doing relatively simple things. The complexity of the airframe and the certification category of the airplane matter much less at that stage than the quality of the instruction and the consistency of the training environment. You are teaching a human brain to do something that is fundamentally unnatural to it. The airplane is the tool, not the subject. Several of the schools that have looked hard at the Spark, including the 3 that have already bought them, are using them explicitly for that early-stage training work, as the introductory airplane in a structured curriculum where students transition to a certified single-engine land aircraft for the later portions of their training that require it. In that role, the Spark is not competing with the Cessna 172 for every training hour. It's competing for a defined slice of the curriculum, where its capabilities are entirely sufficient, and its operating cost advantage is enormous. The operating cost conversation is worth dwelling on for a moment, because the purchase price difference, dramatic as it is actually only part of the economic story. A Rotax 912 ULS, the engine that powers many versions of this aircraft, has a time between overhaul of 1,500 hours and an overhaul cost that is a fraction of what a Lycoming or Continental overhaul runs. The engine drinks automotive-grade MOGAs in addition to avgas, which opens up fuel sourcing flexibility that doesn't exist with a traditional aircraft power plant. It runs on lower power settings that reduce wear and extend component life in ways that the older, heavier reciprocating engines used in traditional trainers simply can't match. Fuel burn is lower, oil consumption is lower, the maintenance intervals are different from what traditional A&P mechanics trained entirely on certified aircraft engines are used to, which does require some shop adjustment, but the documentation and training resources for Rotax maintenance are genuinely robust and widely available in the American market. When a school does the full life cycle cost analysis, not just acquisition cost, but cost per hour flown including fuel, oil, maintenance, engine reserve, and insurance, the numbers tilt even further in favor of the Indian airplane relative to what they were already seeing in the purchase price comparison. We're not talking about a minor cost efficiency at the margin. We are talking about a genuinely transformative difference in the economics of operating a trainer fleet. The kind of difference that shows up not just in the annual profit and loss statement, but in what a school can actually charge students for an hour of instruction, while still making a viable margin. That last point matters enormously for the access to training conversation. Flight training costs in the United States have climbed to levels that are genuinely pricing out portions of the population who would otherwise be qualified, motivated, and capable candidates. A private pilot certificate now commonly runs anywhere from $12,000 to $15,000 at efficient schools in inexpensive markets to $20,000 or more in high-cost areas, and that is before any additional ratings. For a young person pursuing aviation as a career, the capital investment required to get from zero to airline hire eligible, private, instrument, commercial, multi, CFI, a few hundred hours of instruction given, can exceed $100,000 including flight school tuition, and frequently does. That number, more than any single other factor, is where the pipeline problem in American aviation actually lives. It is not a shortage of people who want to fly. It is a shortage of people who can afford to complete the training. If the operating cost structure of a training fleet drops meaningfully, and the instructor productivity that a larger fleet enables allows a school to spread fixed costs across more revenue-generating hours, the downstream math on what training actually costs a student changes. It doesn't change overnight, and no responsible school operator is going to immediately slash student pricing the day new airplanes roll off the delivery truck. But over the medium term, sustainable operating cost reduction at the school level has to eventually show up in what the student is paying, at least for schools competing on value rather than just prestige. The Indian manufacturer, without ever having intended to solve the pipeline problem in American aviation, may be one of the more meaningful structural forces pushing toward making training more accessible than any policy initiative in recent memory. Let's talk about who specifically has bought these airplanes, because the three schools that have made this move publicly or semi-publicly have different profiles, and that variety is important to understand. The first is a small independent flight school in the upper Midwest, a two-airplane operation that has been running on old Cessna 150s for longer than its owner would care to admit. This is a school that has been operationally constrained, not because of lack of students or lack of instructors, but because replacing aging airframes with new certified trainers at current Cessna prices was simply not financially achievable without a level of debt financing that didn't make sense for the business model. The Spark represented the first time in years that a genuinely new airplane was within the school's actual capital budget, rather than a theoretical aspiration. They bought one. They have students flying it. The owner describes the transition in terms that are less about enthusiasm for a foreign-built airplane and more about relief at having a viable path to fleet renewal that the prior pricing environment simply didn't offer. The second is a university-affiliated aviation program at a smaller institution that has been building out a practical flight training component to complement its academic aviation curriculum. University programs are, in some respects, even more sensitive to purchase economics than independent schools, because they're dealing with institutional procurement processes, budget approvals, and oversight structures that make large capital commitments genuinely complicated. A purchase at the Sparks price point versus a Cessna price point is a completely different conversation at the administrative level. When you can frame a fleet acquisition as fitting within existing equipment budget authorization rather than requiring a new capital allocation request, the institutional friction around making the purchase drops dramatically. This program bought two Sparks and has integrated them into early-stage training with an eye toward evaluating whether the curriculum can be structured to maximize their utility across the full range of what light sport aircraft can legally support. The third is a flight school associated with a vocational training organization in the Southeast that has been explicitly focused on lowering barriers to aviation careers for students who would not otherwise be able to access professional-level training. The economics of their student population make the standard pricing for American flight training a genuine barrier, and they've been actively looking for ways to bring cost per training hour down without compromising safety or quality of instruction. The Spark fit that mission. They bought two and have been running them alongside a small fleet of older certified aircraft in a curriculum that sequences students through the light sport work early and transitions them to the certified aircraft for the later portions of their training. 3 different schools, 3 different profiles, 3 different operational contexts, and a consistent underlying logic in all 3 cases. The price gap was simply too large to ignore once they started running the actual numbers. Now, let's be fair and thorough about the objections, because there are real ones, and dismissing them serves no one. The maintenance support question is legitimate. When you operate a certified Cessna or Piper, you are operating in an ecosystem with decades of accumulated infrastructure. Parts stockpiles at distributors, repair stations with specific familiarity with your airframe, type clubs with member knowledge about common issues, service difficulty reports going back generations that tell you what to watch for. The Spark and its Indian manufacturer are not operating in that ecosystem, at least not yet. The Rotax engine side is manageable because that support infrastructure already exists broadly in the American light sport market. But for airframe-specific issues, composite repair, system troubleshooting, finding someone locally who has actually worked on one of these before, the schools that have bought them are, to some extent, breaking new ground. They are the early adopters, which means they are also the ones who will build the knowledge base that the next cohort of buyers inherits. Digifly has established a support agreement structure with their American sales network that includes remote technical assistance, parts shipping commitments, and field service availability. But the honest reality is that no manufacturer can fully substitute for a mature, deep, decades-old support ecosystem in the first few years of market entry. Schools considering this purchase need to go in with eyes open about what support means in year 1 versus what it will mean in year 5. Assuming the company continues to execute and the market presence builds out accordingly. The parts availability question is related but distinct. For consumable and wear items, brake pads, tires, filters, spark plugs, oil, there is no particular challenge because these items are either aviation standard across the light sport fleet or Rotax specific with existing supply chains. For airframe-specific structural components or system-specific replacements, the situation is less clear, and schools need to have an honest conversation with the manufacturer and their support network about lead times and stock availability before they're in a situation where an airplane is AOG and the part they need has a 6-week international shipping window. The insurance conversation is another area where the schools that have already gone through this process have useful information that future buyers need to access. Not every aviation insurance underwriter is equally comfortable with a foreign manufactured light sport aircraft from a company with limited U.S. operational history, and the premium differences between insuring a Cessna and insuring a Spark have reportedly varied significantly depending on the underwriter approached and the specifics of the school's safety record and operational history. Some schools have found competitive rates without significant difficulty. Others have encountered underwriters who declined entirely or quoted premiums that altered the economics meaningfully. Before committing to a purchase, the insurance conversation has to happen first, with multiple brokers, with specific quotes rather than estimates, and with the exact operational details that underwriters will want to see. Resale value is an uncertainty that honest buyers and sellers of this airplane have to acknowledge openly. There is no established used market for these aircraft in the United States because there are essentially no used examples yet. Projecting what a 5-year-old Spark with 1,200 hours on it will sell for in the American secondary market is genuinely speculative in a way that projecting the resale of a comparable hours Cessna is not, because the Cessna has decades of secondary market history to draw on, and the Spark has essentially none. For a flight school that plans to operate an airplane to exhaustion and scrap it rather than trade it, this matters less. For a school that plans to sell in 5 years and roll the proceeds into the next purchase, the resale uncertainty is a real risk factor that belongs in the financial analysis. The student perception question is softer but worth acknowledging because it exists even if it's somewhat uncomfortable to talk about. There is a segment of the student population that has a specific expectation about what airplane they're going to learn to fly in, shaped by decades of cultural imagery around Cessna 172s and the training tradition they represent. A school that switches from the ubiquitous Skyhawk to an airplane most prospective students have never heard of, from a manufacturer whose name doesn't appear in any of the aviation books on their shelf, is going to have some marketing work to do. That's manageable. 3 schools are demonstrably managing it, but it's not nothing. And schools that are heavily dependent on reputation and tradition as part of their brand positioning will navigate this differently than schools whose value proposition is explicitly about cost efficiency and access. Now here is the larger structural story that all of these details are pointing toward, because the Digifly Spark specifically is in many ways less important than what its market entry represents about the trajectory of this industry. The American light aircraft manufacturing industry has operated under a set of assumptions about competition that, for a very long time, were essentially accurate. International manufacturers faced enormous barriers to entry into the American market: certification costs, regulatory complexity, parts and support infrastructure requirements, product liability exposure in the American legal environment, and the cultural and relationship advantages that domestic manufacturers had accumulated over decades of being the default choice for American buyers. Those barriers were real. They are still real. They have not disappeared, but they have become progressively more permeable as the gap between domestic pricing and what international manufacturers can achieve with lower labor costs, different regulatory amortization structures, and different overhead environments has widened to a point where the barrier is no longer prohibitive enough to keep everyone out. The light sport category specifically was, in retrospect, the obvious point of entry, because the certification pathway under ASTM standards was deliberately designed to be more accessible than traditional Part 23 type certification. International manufacturers could achieve ASTM compliance more efficiently than they could achieve an FAA type certificate, and the light sport market, while smaller than the traditional certified aircraft market in absolute sales terms, was large enough in the training segment to justify a serious market entry effort. What has happened with this Indian manufacturer is not an isolated incident. It is the predictable outcome of a price gap that became large enough to justify the investment in market entry, occurring in the segment where the regulatory barrier was designed to be lower, at exactly the moment when American flight schools were most financially strained by the cost of their current options. The question that the established domestic manufacturers need to be asking right now is not whether this specific airplane from this specific company is a serious long-term competitor. The question is what it represents about the direction of competitive pressure in this segment and how their own pricing and product strategy needs to evolve in response to a competitive environment that looks structurally different than it did 5 years ago. Here is the uncomfortable version of that question stated plainly. If an Indian manufacturer can build a Garmin-equipped, Rotax-powered, ASTM-compliant light sport trainer and deliver it to American flight schools at $170,000 to $190,000, what does that tell you about the cost structure that has been driving domestic light sport and primary trainer pricing? Not all of the price differential is explained by labor cost differences or regulatory amortization differences. Some of it is simply the pricing latitude that a dominant market position provides when competitive alternatives don't exist or aren't credible. The arrival of a credible alternative, even a partial one with real limitations, changes that calculation in ways that compound over time. The Cessna 172, at $450,000, is not positioned directly against the Spark. The certification categories are different. The training applications overlap, but don't fully coincide. And for many schools, the 172 does things that the Spark legally cannot do in the American market today. But the schools that are buying Sparks for early-stage training hours are not buying those hours in Cessnas anymore. That is direct revenue impact on the training fleet market for the domestic manufacturer, even if not a direct head-to-head competitive displacement. And if the schools that succeed with this model grow, and if other schools observe that success and replicate the strategy, the cumulative impact on the training aircraft market for domestically manufactured traditional trainers is not trivial. There's a medium-term dimension to this that deserves explicit attention, and it involves the regulatory evolution underway in the light sport category that will shape how significant this competitive challenge becomes over the next several years. The FAA's Mosaic rulemaking, the effort to modernize and expand the light sport aircraft rule, has been working its way through the regulatory process and represents potentially the most significant change to the light sport category since the original rule was established. Among the changes being discussed are increases in the maximum gross weight limit for special light sport aircraft, expansion of the class of airspace and operations available to sport pilots, and potentially broader operational flexibility that would make light sport aircraft more practically useful for a wider range of training applications. If Mosaic or a successor rulemaking expands what a light sport aircraft can legally do in the American training environment, the utility of an airplane like the Spark for flight school operations expands with it, and the portion of a school's training curriculum that can be conducted in a light sport aircraft at a dramatically lower cost per hour potentially grows. This is not a guaranteed outcome on any specific timeline, and anyone who tells you they know exactly when and how Mosaic will finalize and what its precise operational implications will be is telling you more than the evidence currently supports. But the regulatory direction matters for how schools should be thinking about their fleet strategy, because an airplane that today is useful for early-stage light sport training could, under an evolved regulatory framework, be useful for a meaningfully larger share of the curriculum. Schools that are building operational familiarity and institutional knowledge with these airframes now are positioning themselves to scale that use if and when the regulatory picture broadens. Let's talk about what this looks like from the perspective of a flight school owner who is currently running on a fleet of aging certified trainers and trying to decide what the next acquisition looks like. You have several realistic options in front of you, and they're worth laying out honestly because the decision is genuinely more complicated than it was even 3 years ago. Option 1 is the traditional path. Finance 1 or 2 new Cessnas at current pricing, accept the debt service, accept the insurance cost on high-value assets, and continue operating the training model that American flight schools have been running for 60 years. This path has well-understood risks and well-understood rewards. You know what you're getting. Your maintenance shop knows what they're maintaining. Your insurance broker knows how to write the policy. Your students know what airplane they're going to fly. The cost of this certainty is $400,000+ per airframe, and everything that comes with financing that number. Option 2 is the used certified aircraft market, which right now represents both an opportunity and a set of challenges. There are good used Cessna 172s in training configuration available at various price points depending on year, hours, and panel, and a well-maintained mid-time example at a school-appropriate price can extend your fleet at lower capital cost than new. The risks on the used side are maintenance uncertainties as airframes age, the creeping cost of older avionics that may need costly upgrades to meet modern training expectations, and the reality that a 60-year-old airframe design, however proven, is not delivering the same long-term operating cost trajectory as a modern purpose-built aircraft. The used market has also gotten more competitive as more schools have been pushed toward it by new aircraft pricing, which has tightened availability and pushed prices up relative to where they were several years ago. Option 3 is the approach. The 3 schools we've been discussing have taken: buy the Indian-manufactured light sport trainer for the early portions of the curriculum where it legally fits. Structure the curriculum to transition students to certified aircraft for the work that requires it, and use the capital and operating cost savings from the light sport fleet to offset the cost of maintaining a smaller number of certified airframes for the later training stages. This is operationally more complex than a single fleet approach. It requires curriculum restructuring. It requires your instructors to be checked out on multiple airframe types. It requires you to manage 2 separate maintenance relationships and 2 separate insurance conversations. None of that is impossible. These 3 schools are demonstrating that it's not. But it's not simple either, and the administrative burden is real and should be factored into the analysis honestly. Option 4, which is perhaps the most forward-looking and least discussed, is to go all in on a modernization strategy that explicitly restructures your training curriculum around light sport operations at the front end and pursues a regulatory compliant pathway that maximizes the training utility you can extract from lower-cost airframes while building a business model that can survive the current pricing environment for certified aircraft. This is the option that requires the most deliberate strategic planning, the most willingness to depart from traditional approaches, and the clearest read on where the regulatory environment is actually heading. It is also, potentially, the option that positions a school best for the medium term if the cost differential between certified and light sport trainers remains as wide as it currently is. A flight school owner seriously evaluating any of these options needs 3 conversations before they sign anything. They need to talk to a broker who specifically understands the aviation training market and can give them real numbers on what it will cost to insure the specific airframes they're considering with their specific fleet history and safety record. Not estimates, but actual bindable quotes. They need to talk to a maintenance organization that has actual hands-on experience with the airframe type they're considering. And for the Indian-manufactured light sport, that means specifically finding shops that have worked on Rotax-powered composite aircraft and can speak from direct experience rather than theory. And they need to talk to other school operators who have already been through this decision, because the practical knowledge that comes from having actually done it is irreplaceable, and no manufacturer's sales presentation will give it to you. The industry response to this moment is worth examining, because established manufacturers and their dealers are not sitting still while this plays out. Cessna, Textron Aviation in its current corporate identity, has been aware of the pricing pressure in the training market and has not been entirely passive about it. Programs like the Cessna Finance Program and various fleet purchase arrangements for volume buyers have been part of the response, and there has been some adjustment in how the company structures deals with flight schools, specifically compared to private buyer transactions. but the fundamental cost structure that produces a $450,000 trainer has not changed, because it can't change quickly. Manufacturing overhead, product liability, regulatory compliance, labor, and the amortization of certification costs are baked into the economics in ways that can't be surgically removed without fundamentally restructuring the business. Modest adjustments at the margin are possible. A 60% reduction in price is not without a fundamentally different cost structure than American certified aircraft manufacturing currently operates under. Other light sport aircraft manufacturers, the European-built aircraft that have been selling into the American market for years, companies like Pipistrel and Flight Design and others, are watching this development with significant interest, because an Indian manufacturer breaking into the American training market at this price point creates pressure on them as well. They have operated with the assumption that their own price points were competitive within the light sports segment, and an entrant at 60% below the traditional certified price point, but also meaningfully below some competing light sport options, reopens the pricing conversation in ways that benefit buyers and complicate the competitive calculus for everyone who isn't the low-cost option. Dealers, who are the actual point of commercial contact for most school acquisitions, are having a more complicated version of this conversation because they represent manufacturers and earn their margin on the gap between wholesale and retail. A dealer who has been selling Cessnas and collecting a meaningful per-unit margin on each transaction is not going to enthusiastically steer customers toward an alternative that pays them a smaller absolute margin per unit, even if the alternative better serves the customer's financial interest. This is not a criticism of dealers as a class. It is simply the predictable behavior of any business operating within a commission or margin structure. But it means that a flight school doing its homework should not rely exclusively on conversations with established dealers to discover the full range of their options. The information environment on the buyer side of this transaction is genuinely better when you go looking for alternatives proactively rather than waiting for them to be presented to you. The three schools that have already moved are, in a sense, performing a real-world experiment that the rest of the flight training industry is going to be watching with significant attention over the next 2 to 3 years. Not just watching whether the airplanes work, the basic airworthiness is already established by the certification process, but watching whether the operating cost advantages materialize as projected, whether the maintenance support structure proves adequate in practice, whether student outcomes in the structured curriculum that uses the light sport airframe for early training are equivalent to outcomes from a purely Cessna-based training environment, and whether the economics translate into competitive student pricing that attracts enrollment. If those three schools report positive operational experience, and the early signals from the ones already flying are apparently sufficiently positive that they agreed to be part of a sales story that the Indian manufacturer can share with prospective buyers, the follow-on wave of schools looking seriously at this option is going to be substantially larger than the current three. And if that wave arrives at scale, the implications for the training aircraft market in the United States are not incremental, they are structural. There's a student perspective here that deserves its own moment, because students are ultimately who this is all about. If you are a prospective pilot right now, or a current student working your way through a certificate, the story of an Indian manufacturer undercutting domestic trainers by 60% and selling to American flight schools might feel abstract and industry internal. It doesn't have an obvious direct effect on your training experience today. But it is part of a larger shift that could meaningfully affect the cost and accessibility of your training over the medium term in ways that matter very concretely to you. Flight training costs what it costs, partly because the cost of training equipment is what it is. If the cost of training equipment in the light sport and primary trainer segments comes down structurally, not as a one-time discount, but as a sustained shift in what competitive market pricing looks like, that is eventually going to exert downward pressure on what schools charge students per hour. Not quickly, not uniformly across all schools in all markets, not without a lag as individual schools make acquisition decisions on their own timelines and pass through cost savings on their own schedules. But the direction of the pressure, if this trend continues, is in favor of students rather than against them. There's also a more immediate implication if you're at a school that is in the process of making these fleet decisions right now. A school that is seriously evaluating the Indian manufactured light sport trainer, or that has already bought one, is a school that is thinking carefully about cost structure and training economics in a way that most schools haven't had to think about before. That level of operational engagement tends to correlate with schools that are also thinking carefully about instructor development, curriculum design, and student experience. because the same operators who are willing to challenge the assumption that Cessnas are the only training option are often the ones who are willing to challenge other assumptions about how flight training is structured and delivered. That's not a universal rule, but it's a pattern worth noticing if you're evaluating schools and trying to understand which ones are genuinely innovating and which ones are running on inertia. There's a final dimension of this story that I want to spend time on, because it's the one that is least discussed in the immediate sales and acquisition conversation, but that may ultimately prove the most significant. It has to do with what this moment represents for the longer arc of global aviation manufacturing competition and what it signals about where that competition is heading. India has made a deliberate, sustained national investment in building a domestic aerospace manufacturing capability. The country has a growing base of trained aerospace engineers, a manufacturing ecosystem that has matured significantly over the past 2 decades through both domestic development and international partnership, and a government that has explicitly identified aerospace as a strategic sector for investment and development. The DigiFly Spark is not the product of an overnight entrepreneurial inspiration. It is the product of a manufacturing and engineering capability that has been building for years, operating first in the domestic Indian market, where it developed real operational experience and product refinement before attempting entry into the much more demanding and much more regulated American market. This is the same trajectory that South Korean automotive manufacturers followed into the American car market. It is the trajectory that Chinese solar panel manufacturers followed into global clean energy supply chains. It is, at a different scale and in a different sector, a recognizable pattern. A manufacturer from a lower-cost base develops real capability, validates it in domestic and emerging markets, and then enters a developed market at a price point that established domestic players cannot easily respond to, because the price differential is rooted in structural cost differences that don't yield to incremental efficiency improvements. Aviation certification and product liability environment makes this trajectory harder and slower than it was in automobiles or consumer electronics. The regulatory barriers are real, and they are not going to disappear. An Indian manufacturer is not going to be selling type-certificated multi-engine aircraft into the American training market next year. But in the light sports segment specifically, where the regulatory pathway was designed to be more accessible, the trajectory is already visible, and the early chapters of this story are already written. What happens in the next 3 to 5 years? How many more American schools buy these airplanes? How the operating experience data develops? How the regulatory environment for light sport evolves? How the established domestic manufacturers respond to the competitive pressure will determine how this story's middle chapters read. Understanding that this is not just a story about one Indian airplane company selling to 3 American schools, but rather a story about the early stages of a competitive dynamic that has the potential to reshape the economics of flight training in the United States, is the thing that distinguishes a thoughtful response from a dismissive one. The dismissive response says, this is a niche product with a niche certification and limited training applications, and the Cessna is never going anywhere, so why does this matter? The thoughtful response says, a 60% price differential in a market under serious financial strain is a